Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Scott Hodgins. I am the manager of Cohort Wholesale. We're a distributor of outdoor fruit and vegetable crop protection products. We work with retailers across Canada to support growers in all of the key horticultural crops and markets. Today, during our presentation, I am pleased to be joined by Dr. James Adams from Nicino America, who's going to review for us the powdery mildew life cycle and introduce a new fungicide that we can use to control it. I'll introduce Dr. Adams in greater detail in a moment, but before I do, I'd like to review some housekeeping items. First, the webinar is going to be recorded and will be made available to all the attendees and registrants about 24 hours after the live broadcast. This session is scheduled to run for approximately 60 minutes. Dr. Adams is going to speak for about 45, and then at the end of that, we'll open the floor to questions. If you have any questions at any point in the presentation, please type them into the questions tab on the Zoom control panel on your screen. Before I turn the discussion over to Dr. Adams, I'd like to share some of his background with you. Dr. James Adams is the Vice President of Product Development with Nicino America. He's originally from Richmond, Virginia, received his master's from Virginia Tech and his PhD in plant pathology from the University of Delaware. James began working in crop protection industry with Monsanto, first in Montana and later in St. Louis, before he returned to the East Coast to work for a legacy Bayer crop science company. Dr. Adams has also worked in agricultural biotech with DNA plant technology and ecoscience, and also as a technical and business consultant in vegetable production in Canada, US, Mexico, and Europe. James joined Nicino America in 2003 as Director of Marketing, where he was responsible for the launch of both ET herbicide and Fugimite miticide. And more recently, he returned to the technical side of the business to lead Nicino America's new product development functions. And he's done that for the past 15 years. James, thank you very much for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Scott, for that very kind introduction. Welcome, everyone. I am going to attempt today to do my best to provide you with a reasonable overview of not only the powdery mildew fungi, but also how the mode of action of Gatton fungicide fits into that scheme and how it can help you in your production. So everyone's been, like it or not, has been around powdery mildew. If you step outside of your home, whether you have crops or house plants or what have you, it's everywhere. So powdery mildew fungi are ubiquitous. It's commonly seen that a lot of the characteristics of one species of powdery mildew carries over to others. They have a lot of things in common, and we'll go over that in a second. But I would say that the information we're giving here today is very general because you do see some differences in some species of powdery mildew fungi from crop to crop. So we're dealing in generalities today, not specifics when it comes to the fungus. One of the things about powdery mildew that can be so devastating is that it does have an effect on other diseases. In some crops, that's not an issue, but in crops like grapes, where you have soft tissue in the fruit, powdery mildew can lead into numerous problems that go beyond just mildew control. So these are unique fungi, but they're very peripheral. It's interesting that in the world of disease control, people are afraid of powdery mildew from the prospect of overusing modes of action and developing or having the fungi develop resistance. And yet really in terms of what these do, they're sort of almost gentle fungi compared to the typical fungus that penetrates deep into the cells and sometimes becomes systemic in the plant material. So they're very peripheral, yet they can cause damage in a couple of ways. On most crops, really what they're doing is reducing photosynthesis, which in turn ultimately reduces yield and quality of the crop itself. In some crops, again, like grape, strawberry, and in some varieties of cherry, The soft fruit following infection by the mildew ends up causing infection court, which results in botrytis, penicillium, rhizopus, any number of other fungi coming in and causing these fruits to rot on the vine. So powdery mildews can be everything from a little bit peripheral and slightly yield reducing to really devastating your crop, depending on which species you're talking about. Mildews, similar to other ascomycete fungi, and this is an ascomycete, so this is really, Ascomycota is the bulk of the fungi that cause plant diseases around the world. There are others, basidiomycetes and the so-called phycos, but the majority of what we encounter from a disease control perspective on a number of crops are ascomycetes. As in this case, you have both asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction. In the case of the asexual reproduction, which is what most of us see, the white powdery masses on the leaves are a combination of mycelia and spores. In this case, the asexual spores are the conidiophores. So this is really the dominant part of the life cycle, once you have infection of a plant. However, they produce lots and lots of spores. And one of the unique things about powdery mildew fungi that are very, very different from almost all other fungal spores is that these spores are turgid. They already have moisture in them. Most fungi require, we call free water to germinate and infect plants. So they can a certain amount of moisture, rainfall, etc. In the case of powdery mildew fungi, they only require high humidity because they already have the energy from the moisture in the spore to push out the germ tubes and cause infection. So powdery mildews are very unique in that respect. Sexual reproduction, and I won't go through all of these, but they do have a definite sexual stage in which they reproduce and they are able to undergo meiosis. That's the stage where if you're worried about resistance developing, exchanging genetic material of isolates that are susceptible to fungicides with those that are not, that's where bad things can happen. You and I generally do not see this stage very often. It's out there. It's hard to see, and we'll see some photos in a second of that. But it is a very key stage in that these fungi reproduce rapidly during the appropriate temperature and moisture conditions, and they do reproduce sexually, which again is one of the reasons that they develop resistance to fungicide modes of action so quickly. And just to some photos, you see at the top, I don't know if you can see my pointer, hope you can see here, they look like little dots. Those are actually the structures, Cleistothecia as they used to be called, that hold the ascospores that are the sexual stage. And again, to the naked eye, you would see little dots in the mycelium on the leaf. And when you blow these up in a microscopic look, you can see what they look like. Here's the ascocarp and then the ascospores and the asci that are released. Life cycle is very simple, but it's worth, as we go through this presentation, to think a little bit about it and what's happening. And this applies not only to what I'll say about gattin fungicide, but any mode of action fungicide you're using. It really does help to know something about the life cycle, because that really ultimately will determine how well your particular fungicide choice works when you're using it in real life. So you see there's a spore over here, lands on the plant. In 3 to 4 hours, that spore will germinate. Again, that spore is turgid, it has moisture in it. So there's nothing short of a bird coming and picking it off that's going to stop that. The next thing is the structure that differentiates from the germ tube called an adversarial hook. Now that's going to take maybe a total of 12 hours, close to half a day from where that spore lands on the surface of the plant. And that is really the beginning of the infection. You can see a little hook there that starts to help penetrate. There's a thing called an infection peg that pushes through the surface of the leaf. And then you have what is called the haustorial formation. It's the haustorium here. That is the part of the fungus that extracts nutrition from the plant. And as you can see, from the time that spore landed on the leaf to the time the haustorium is formed, only took about 1 day. And then after yet another 24 hours, the haustorial structure will start putting out secondary hyphae all over the place. And you can see there'll be multiple penetration of the leaf. After that, you'll have what is called mycelial extension, not a very specific term, but basically you start having growth of the mycelium out of the hyphae and onto the surface of the leaf. And then after about 4 days, then you'll have conidia formation. Now, those are structures on which the asexual conidia are formed. And then, and only then, do you actually see these additional symptoms on the leaf. So really, from the time this landed and penetrated, which was about half a day to actually start the infection process, to where you can see something is going to be 4, sometimes 5 days. So one of the things, and we'll talk about this again multiple times in the presentation, is that everyone involved in this industry stresses the use of preventative applications of fungicides. However, none of us can actually see any of this, right? We can see this, we can see the spores and the mycelium, but a lot of this is just not available to the naked eye in the field. So that means sometimes, regardless of the fungicide you're using, you are going to, in many cases, apply your fungicide post-infection. So it will be not a preventative application completely. People sometimes will say that, well, such and such fungicide didn't work as well as I thought. I still had some lesions, et cetera, et cetera. Well, most likely it's not fungicide resistance. It's simply the fact that you can't see that infection has already taken place. And depending on the mode of action of that particular fungicide, it may or may not have effect on the Haustoria, Conidia-4 production, et cetera. So that's very important to remember when using any fungicide. Okay, that leads me into today's main topic, which is Gatton fungicide, the active ingredient fluteanil, and we have it registered in the US under the brand name, and will be registered in Canada under the name Gatton. I won't go on. There's actually some Japanese terminology that's responsible for that name, and but I'm not going to go into that now. What can Gatton do for a crop manager? Well, one of the things that's very good about Gatton is that it gives you extended control of powdery mildew. Although most of the time people are going to be on a 14-day interval on crop plants, we have done quite a few studies in the US on this, looking at extended control of powdery mildew. So we know this will go out to 21, maybe even 28 days and still have a strong effect against powdery mildew fungi. So that's telling you that in a normal 14-day rotation, you have some buffer with this product. If it rains, if something happens, if you can't get into the field, it's not going to break down at 14 days. You have a little buffer with this, to say the least. It does target multiple powdery mildew stages, and we'll get into those places in a second, for both preventative and some post-infection control. And I'll explain that again in a second. It is a unique mode of action. So this is different from any other mode of action that's currently on the market and even known, as far as we know, to date, which again with powdery mildew is very important, because rotating modes of action that are effective is your best way of maintaining the products that you have. Repeated use of almost any mode of action against powdery mildew fungi is a recipe for disaster. So how does Gatton work? I mentioned before, Haustoria are key to fungal nutrition. If it cannot form Haustoria, and that's any fungus, not just powdery mildew, then the damage is most certainly limited and the fungus dies. So it inhibits secondary hyphae extension on Haustoria. So even if you've had infection, haustorial formation in the cell, Gatton will work against the fungus and stop it there. It's inhibiting total formation of the haustorium. So it's acting at various body parts, if you will, there. So as you'll see in some of the micrographs, it's it's pretty obvious what's going on there. The other thing it does, and this is a secondary effect, but very important, is that it causes malformation of conidiaphores. So again, even if you have had infection, even if haustoria formed, and even if structurally they're starting to try to form these conidiophores that differentiate into the conidia that disperse and cause more infection, Gatton can still stop that process. So if you look at the cycle here, going back to the 1 hour through 12 hours, Gatton's not going to do anything up to this point. It does not affect spores. It does not affect germ tube elongation. It does not affect the formation of the adversarial hook that causes the initial penetration into the cell. However, where Gatton starts really doing its thing is here with haustorial formation. So it greatly inhibits haustorial formation and inhibits the expansion of hyphae from the haustoria. And in so doing, it's going to inhibit conidial formation and differentiation of conidia. So you have multiple points in the life cycle of the fungus where Gatton is going to have a dramatic effect in terms of stopping the activity of the organism. Just very quickly, these are micrographs, stained micrographs in this case. Looking at this is a normal haustorial production. You can see this little thing here that looks like a spaceship. It's got these little tentacles coming out, and those are the differentiated hyphae that are absorbing nutrition from the cell. In the case of Gatton, you had an haustorium there, but you can see almost no production of these appendages that are responsible for sucking the nutrients out of the cell. Looking at conidiophores, this is normal conidial production. So you have conidiophores that then differentiate into these distinct little spores, and I distinct like millions of these things. Here, when you treat with Gatton, even if you've had conidiophore production, you can see that it stops the differentiation. You can see where they tried to make a septation there to make a spore, nothing happened, and you can see that's what it does. So again, highly effective at multiple stages. Okay, just for some examples, it always helps to have some comparisons here. And again, this is one of the things that's very important when you're using fungicides, is to have a pretty good idea, not only the mode of action category of it to make sure that you're not using the same MOA over and over, but also knowing what that particular mode of action is doing, where it's attacking the fungus. And that can a lot of times explain why you either have good, mediocre, or poor results when you apply fungicides. So again, we already talked about with Gatton, you're looking at the secondary but very strong effect on conidiophores, and then haustorial formation, as well as the differentiated hyphae in the cell that are sucking the nutrients for the haustoria. In the case of Quadris, azoxystrobin, which is a QOI inhibitor, it's been on the market a long time. This is where it affects it. It does not affect conidiophores, spore germination, or the actual penetration, but the extension of the adversarial hook. So the adversarial hook is formed, and right when that is trying to penetrate the cell and start to cause actual infection, that's where Quadris comes in and works its magic. Quinoxaphene, my understanding is that quinoxaphene no longer will be available in Canada, but of course it has been available for many years up till now. So Quintec, you can see that Quintec, one of the reasons Quintec has been such a good fungicide is that it is hitting powdery mildews at 3 points. Number one, it will affect spore germination, which is a very good thing. So the spore lands on the leaf surface, but it does affect it. It will affect adversarial hook formation. So if the spore is germinated, it will still stop that. And then if it has gone to there, it will affect and retard adversarial hook extension. Again, if you look back at Quintec effect, it's been a highly effective powdery mildew fungicide over the years. You can see the reason why here, that it is actually working on those 3 areas. So that gives you a little bit of a buffer. And similarly, going back to Gatton, having the multiple timings especially after the spore's already landed and you can't tell whether you've had infection yet or not. That's really the strength of the Gatton and why it works so well. So active ingredient, fluteanil, a unique U13 frac group. It's a thiazolide group. It's a new group. There's nothing like it out there to date. Again, it's a novel and unknown mode of action. Work is being done to elucidate mode of action, but sometimes, especially with powdery mildew fungi, that's very difficult. Most fungicides are active on more than just powdery mildews. So you can do in vitro studies with different fungi that can be cultured in a lab. The powdery mildew fungi are called obligate biotrophs, and therefore you cannot culture them in the lab, and it makes it much more difficult to actually do mode of action studies because of that. The formulation, very simple. There's a 5EC formulation that will become available. I mentioned before, it's fast acting. It starts with working within 24 hours of application. A lot of work is done in the US and also in Europe and Japan with this product. And it is compatible with any number of fertilizers, micronutrients, insecticides, sulfur, and other fungicides. We've never come across anything to date that was problematic with this product. pH stability range is also excellent, 4 to 9. That's not to say there aren't some places around North America where pH can creep up above 9, but basically that's a nice range to be able to work in. And last and certainly not least, because we're talking about specialty crops here where appearance is very important, no phytotoxicity has ever been observed in any trials or commercial use with the product. And I'm talking anywhere it's registered in the world. And this would include doing studies where we go up to more than double the highest rate of the product. So we're very comfortable with the safety profile on all the crops that are registered. IPM compatibility, that is a question that comes out a lot, especially, even if you're not worrying about your fungicides, with your insecticides, people use IPM in almost any crop to try to manage situations and avoid blowing out the beneficial insects. And in this case, because of the unique mode of action, there's no insecticidal activity of any kind. And we have not run across any situation where there's a problem. It's an excellent rotational product, of course, because to manage fungicide resistance with the unique mode of action. And in the US, we'd have to say practically non-toxic because EPA won't allow us to say non-toxic anymore. So I'm not quite sure what PMRA says, but it really is non-toxic to non-target organisms, including bees and, of course, other fungi. It's not going to have any activity on apple scab or monolinea or anything like that. So this is a powdery mildew product. Okay, how does it look when you're looking at efficacy versus typical programs? Here you can see that based on severity on grape clusters, this is work that was done at Michigan State University a couple of years ago. They really through the kitchen sink at us in their program, they use full season on this. And you can see that Gatton held up very, very well under the program. And in fact, I'm not going to question Tim Miles' data collection here, but my experience in Michigan in particular is that they have so much botrytis and black dot and other things in their grapes that I'd be willing to bet that even this 5% severity here on Gatton is probably a bit misleading because Gatton was kind of under the gun in terms of having all the other diseases present. This one done by Doug Gubler, the late professor of plant pathology at UC Davis, who is pretty much a legend in grape pathology around the world. He tested this several times over the years, and you can see that versus pristine, which at the time for him was the standard in grapes, basically perfect control in terms of severity on Chardonnay. And Chardonnay in particular is very susceptible to powdery mildew. Cabernet grapes, this one was done up at Washington State University. Washington State loves their red wines. You see here, we were looking at Procure, Pristine, Rally Quintec rotation, and then a Gatton again, and you can see Gatton is as good as the best. Wine grapes again, Gary Grove at Prosser, Washington, same kind of results this time with Pristine and a Nova Quintec rotation. Same thing here from some Italian work, looking at Vivando, which is another one of the modes of action that is used as a, as a powdery mildew only mode of action that's unique. Quintec, again, as a reference point, and Gatton, and you can see Gatton is providing, virtually 100% control in terms of severity of grape leaf bunches. So I wanted to, again, to go back to this idea of what it looks like when you're talking about infection or preventative versus post-infection applications. And I think a lot of people are probably, at least on grapes and maybe cherries too, familiar with the going in with products like potassium bicarbonate and similar products. When you just, sometimes you end up with a mess and you have to do something. And I want to distinguish here because those products are basically desiccants. You apply them to the leaf surface, and what you do is you dry up the fungal spores and the mycelium. And, frankly, we use a fair amount of potassium bicarbonate in grapes, at least in California in the US, year in, year out. And it's very effective as a desiccant. However, that's all it does. So if you've used products like potassium bicarbonate in the past and you have heavy mildew pressure, you know that you're either going to tank mix a systemic mode of action fungicide with that, or you're going to follow up very quickly because all you're doing is desiccating. There's no residual from those products. So what happens in the case of Gatton is this. You are not desiccating. Whoops. My pointer's too touchy. You're not desiccating the mycelium. So here's going from 7 days where you actually had symptomology on the leaf when you applied out to 28 days. And you can see the normal progression in the untreated. You basically go to complete coverage and then a lot of leaf necrosis. You're actually causing the leaf to turn brown. On the other hand, with Gatton going across the gamut, basically nothing changes. So you apply the product, it moves into the leaf, and Gatton is translaminar, so it does move to the underside of the leaf as well. And so you apply the product, it moves in, but after, in this case, you can see 4 weeks, you're going to still see those initial symptoms on the leaf. So that's something very important to remember. So if you do apply it in the situation, it's going to be effective in terms of preventing further nutrient extraction from the leaf by the Haustoria of the fungi. It's going to start having a dramatic reduction in conidial production, if that's already started. But unlike the desiccants, you will still see after a month, you'll still see some remnants of that initial infection because it's not doing anything to that mycelium and spores that's on the top of the leaf. It's stopping the nutrition, of course, but the symptoms in that case don't go away in terms of what you see at the beginning. But it does prevent this from happening. And of course, ultimately, that's what you want. So my recommendation is always approach powdery mildew control with a preventative program. And in the back of your mind, assume that you may already have a little infection out there. And I'm talking about regardless of the fungicide you're using. Be aware that just because you don't see it does not mean it's not there doing something. But Gatton strength is really in part of a preventative program. And when you're growing grapes and cherries and cucurbits, you want to be on top of things. You do not want to give this fungus a chance to start spreading because powdery mildew spread quickly. And again, you can stop the expansion of infections. You can prevent secondary infections, secondary spread, which is very important. But again, you might see some symptoms if you spray late. And again, in a post-infection application, you can certainly mix with, I think Millstop is one of the potassium bicarbonates, but you can certainly mix with a Millstop, a sulfur, There are other desiccants out there that I'm aware of. And, if you really, really want to simply not see any of that white stuff there, or if you have gotten into a situation where it's really bad and a lot of leaf coverage from the mycelium, then of course you would almost certainly want to put one of these desiccants with the Gatton in that application to make sure that you dry that stuff up, because as I said at the top of the presentation, one of the main ways that powdery mildews affect crops adversely is by preventing photosynthesis. So, it's very simple. You put the leaf in the dark, it does not photosynthesize. And having white mycelium covering the leaf is going to keep that from happening. One other little point here, and it's not so little actually, is that there are a lot of fungicides, both contact and very highly systemic products, where adjuvant doesn't really have a huge effect on your results. However, sometimes adjuvants can be pretty important. And one of the things that we found with Gatton is the addition of a good silicone surfactant, a good NIS, what have you, with it, most likely is going to improve the efficacy. Now, Gatton is a translaminar product, so it's moving, it's going to be on both the top of the leaf and the bottom of the leaf, which for powdery mildew is very important, but it is not systemic. So having an adjuvant with the Gatton is going to help with the leaf coverage. It's going to help you get thorough coverage, enhance that, and in all likelihood, it is going to enhance the efficacy of the product, as you can see here. So, commercial experience. I can tell you, since we launched this product in the US in 2019, we have had 0 performance inquiries commercially. I mean, no one has called our salespeople up and said, I think I have a problem where it doesn't look like it's working. Absolute 0. And I have never, ever in my lifetime worked with any product, be it fungicide, insecticide, herbicide, where I could say that. I mean, there are always going to be issues in the field, application timing, mistakes in rates, misunderstanding about the spectrum of activity, what have you. And sometimes, as I call them, acts of God, where no matter what you do, you can't figure out what happened. But in the case of Gatton, to date, and we're into another season now in the US already with this, we have had no performance inquiries with the product. It just works. And when I say excellent performance here, it is excellent. The nice thing about this is early on, we had a discussion, and this was in the US, about how to position the use of the product most effectively. And a lot of emphasis was put on the fact that it is a unique mode of action. And I think for powdery mildew control on crops, that's an extremely important factor. However, I can safely say that, again, of the powdery mildew products that are out there on the market today in North America, and all the different modes of action and all the different co-formulations of modes of actions available, Gatton is one of the very best powdery mildew products available in the US. And again, no crop safety concerns. We've never had any issues whatsoever. On the Canadian side, obviously this product is not quite registered yet, but will be soon, we hope. A lot of work has been done since 2020, looking at grape and cherry in particular. A lot of trials out there to look at the efficacy. The performance has been, as we would expect in Canada, just as good as it is in the US. Yet again, the same situation where there are no crop safety concerns. So this is just, gosh, even if this was, not a unique mode of action, it would still be an incredible powdery mildew fungicide. But when you throw in the unique mode of action with the product and the fact that it does stop powdery mildew fungi even after infection has occurred in the plant, this is quite a product. Best management practices, as per any product, any program, again, preventative is the way to approach things with fungicides. And again, it's translaminar, not systemic, so thorough coverage and use of a good approved non-ionic or silicon surfactant really will help you go to bed and sleep better at night, because there will be times when there's a definite effect from that, especially when you get situations where you have very heavy foliage and coverage is, a potential issue. This is the rate, very simple, apply at 470 mLs per hectare. Not, just very, very simple, just go at it at that rate. And I will say, we have built in, I'm not encouraging anyone ever to go below rates, but one of the things with fungicides that you want to avoid is, this is when you have fungi that are completely sensitive to your fungicide. There's no resistance out there. One of the problems that I've seen with many different modes of action over the years is the tendency to try to cut rates on fungicides. And some of these fungicides are very powerful early on, and you will see for a couple of years, you'll see the same control from a half rate that you get from a full rate. However, what you're doing, and you don't see it at that point in time, you are selecting for tolerant and resistant isolates of that fungus. And eventually, by doing this, you will reduce the efficacy of the product at the full use rates in the field. Now, in the case of Gatton, we have a robust rate, and part of the reason there is that we would like to see this Gatton as an available tool for growers in North America for the next 20, 30 years. And the way to do that is sticking with the recommended rate. Don't cut the rates just because you can get away with it, but keep the rate high. Make sure you kill the powdery mildew. Don't leave resistant mildew isolates in the field. And once again, just to remind you, it is very pH stable, but you get out that range, there are plenty of agriculturally approved buffers that could be used to buffer your solution. Okay, a few practical things also in terms of managing it. It is stable in the tank overnight. Obviously, everyone knows you'll leave something sitting in the tank overnight. Ideally, you would keep the thing agitated the whole time, but if you don't, make sure that you, whether it's bypass or paddle or whatever you're using, that you do agitate it, thoroughly prior to going back out in the field. It's rain fast within 3 hours. Unfortunately, we have not yet done definitive work on shorter time frames with this, but we do know that at least within 3 hours that you're fine. Reentry interval is 12 hours, which for the most part should not be an issue with anyone. Pre-harvest on cherries is 3 days, grape is 14 days. Cucurbits is once it's dried on the leaf surface. And I will say here also that the residue data that were used for these crops and these pre-harvest intervals were pretty extreme programs. Most of these were 6 applications on very short intervals at basically double the use rate that will be recommended in Canada. So if you're applying the product and you're observing these, and of course on cherry, I don't imagine why you'd be out there 3 days before harvest spraying a fungicide anyway, at least for powdery mildew. That's a little late. And even grapes, 14 days, I think by then maybe something should have been done. So really only cucurbits is really the only one where you would consistently be applying fungicide right around harvest, obviously, because of the continuous flowering. And you can see once the product dries on the leaf surface, you're good to go in terms of the pre-harvest intervals and the tolerances. Maximum applications allowed on the label 4 times a year, no more than 2 sequential applications, but I would just, strong advice here is that rotate your fungicide. You can go twice in a row with this, no problem, but if you have, please don't use it 3 or 4 times in a row. That's just asking for trouble. MRLs these days in this world we live in, MRLs are always topics of conversation. I personally do not know what the profile looks like on Canadian exports of apple, cherry, grape to various areas. My assumption is that a fair amount of the produce is brought into the U.S., but there are obviously going to be other export markets in Asia, et cetera. You can see that at the moment, prior to having tolerances set in Canada, that it's set at the default, obviously, for GAT. That will change when tolerances are issued for Canada for at least the apple, cherry, and the cucurbits. In the UK, there's only one tolerance issued for the product to date, and that is on grapes at 0.15 ppm. Now, the reason, if you go over to the US, I'll answer this before someone asks it here. The reason that the EU/Great Britain tolerance is lower is that they went out with a completely different residue program, longer PHIs, et cetera, et cetera. But we, practically speaking, this is not an issue with the product, because you're not going to even have this level of residues with normal use of the product. And you can see in Japan, they have the product's been registered there for several years, and you can see the various ranges. One thing I will point out to you, if you're interested in MRLs, is they use very high rates of products in Japan when they do residue work. And you can see that on cucurbits here, that they're at 0.07 parts per million as their tolerance, even using very high rates. That gives you a pretty good idea that you're not going to end up with extreme residues from use of this product, if you're doing it within the PHI norm. So I'm getting near my close, and it's a good thing because I'm almost out of time here. So just remember, you're talking about GAT, new fungicide with a new mode of action. It's different from anything else out there. It will provide extended control of powdery mildews on grapes, cherries, cucurbits, and of course, anything else that might be registered in Canada in the future. It targets multiple stages of the powdery mildew fungus for both preventative and post-infection control. Again, not completely unique, but one of the unique aspects of GAT in general. And again, powered by a unique mode of action, and it is going to control existing biotypes of powdery mildew fungi that are resistant to other modes of action. So it's a great product, and a great product for rotations. And with that, I'll go to this slide. These are the people that will help you. If someone calls me up and asks me a question about catting at any time, I'm certainly going to answer your questions enthusiastically. But these are the people at Cohort Wholesale that are going to be your best resource for determining what you use, availability of product, and everything else. And they're a good group, and I think they can do a lot to help you get off to a successful start with GAT. So thank you very much for listening to me talk about GAT and powdery mildew fungicide. And I think we're going to segue into question and answer part. Are we not, Scott?
We are. Thanks very much, James, for the presentation. We've had a few questions come in, so we'll try to have you answer those. The first one, and I think you covered it in the discussion, but just to confirm, does GAT control any other diseases besides powdery mildew?
The answer, practically.
Okay. Thank you. You also mentioned that Gatton was an excellent replacement or alternative for Quintec. Quintec's a group 13, and Gatton is a group U13. Are these the same?
No, they're not. Group 13 actually is a mode, it's a known mode of action that's been elucidated. Unknown 13 simply means that in FRAC, the Fungicide Resistance Action Committee, we are the 13th unknown mode of action to be classified. So the next time one of these comes along and it's an unknown, it will be U14. So they are not the same.
Thank you. So a nice alternative with a new mode of action.
Correct.
A couple of questions about the potential for potential for resistance development with Gatton.
Well, I look at powdery mildew fungi, and this is with any mode of action, not just Gatton. I think, and most plant pathologists that work with powdery mildews would agree that of the fungal pathogens out there that cause plant diseases, at least, that powdery mildew fungi are arguably the most likely to develop resistance to any mode of action. Now, having said that, part of the reason with powdery mildew, like many other fungi, is simply repetition. You keep challenging the fungus over and over. And I think probably at this point, and I'm talking North America here, not Japan or anywhere else, but in North America, US and Canada, we have a sufficient number of effective modes of action against powdery mildew that if we manage them properly, we could expect to see very few cases of resistance develop, including to this U13 mode of action. It's just, resistance is a funny thing. They can predict certain modes of action because of their specificity that, you're going to see resistance, within a few years of being in the market, no matter what. But with most fungicidal mode of actions, it's really, it's a statistical game. If you manage it correctly, if you have, say you have to spray 4 times on a crop for powdery mildew. If you year in, year out, use 4 different modes of action on that crop, rotate those, and even sometimes bring in other new modes of action, your likelihood of developing powdery mildew, having powdery mildew resistant fungi out there is very, very low. But if you go out there year after year and blow it away with SDHIs and triazoles and QOIs, multiple times with the same mode of action, it's going to happen. So there's no way at this point in time I can predict development or lack thereof of resistance to this, but I believe managed properly, likelihood is very low.
Thank you. A couple of questions about a plan or interest in expanding the proposed label down the road to include other crops besides grapes, cherries, and cucurbits, and specific questions about other stone fruit or strawberries.
Well, that would be, of course, up to some business discussions between your group and Nichino America, Scott. I think we don't have a completely full complement of crops in the U.S., but we obviously do have more crops in the U.S. That are registered for use. And I would hope either through simply normal commercial progress or even PMRA's minor use crop program that we would be able to get some additional crops onto the label in the future. I think everyone on both sides, both in Canada and the US, I think that ultimately is our goal. It's just that this is sort of an incremental exercise here with the product.
Great. James, the use of summer oils is really increasing in Canada. Any concerns with using Gatton either in a tank mix or in rotation either before or after with summer oils?
Well, we don't have much experience with summer oils with Gatton in the US. Most of our powdery mildew market, with the exception of that's up in the Finger Lakes in New York, it's cut off pretty early in the season. Cherries obviously are a short season crop, so the time between shuck split and harvest is sometimes only 45 days. So in our markets in the US, we don't usually get into summer oils with any of that. And the same thing, if you look at the Washington, Oregon, and California grape markets, you will see the same pattern there, but particularly in California, we get cut off early. You don't go much past the 3rd week of June for powdery mildew applications in grapes in California because it's too hot. The organism doesn't do anything then. The exception would be the Finger Lakes region of New York and the wine grapes there, and that pretty much goes on throughout the summer, just because of the nighttime, the moderate temperatures and the lake effect, et cetera. And I honestly don't have any experience with summer oils in that market.
I can maybe just share some of our own practical experience from our trials over the last 2 years here in Canada. And we've had instances where it's been used in combination and no concerns. Nothing came up. Can you mix Gatton with biological products, specifically living organism type products like Stargis, for example?
Yeah, I mean, as long as your biological product's not powdery mildew, you're fine. So it's not going to have any effect, activity on other fungi, bacteria, etc.
Another question, could you confirm that this is a different mode of action from Miravis Duo?
Oh, yes, certainly is.
Okay, thank you. Will Gatton redistribute to expanding tissue?
No, it will not. The material, while it is translaminar, is not systemic. Hence the emphasis on coverage and the use of a good NIS or silicon surfactant. But it is not a systemic product, so it is not going to redistribute.
Okay. And it also supports the recommendation of applications every 14 days as tissue expands.
Yeah, it does. I will say, though, I did briefly mention, I didn't really give any particulars on it, but in the grape market in particular, we have done a lot of work in California on extended, just for our own internal knowledge. And we can go up to 28 days on grapes. Now, how much true leaf expansion and growth you're having at that time is difficult to say, but we do know that at 14 days, it's not at the end of the road in terms of control. And cherries, of course, you get a crop like cherries, if it's very, very early season, obviously you're going to get foliage expansion beyond that. But cherries and apples, both, part of the issue with powdery mildew control that affects what you get ultimately is how well you control the primary infection. And in the case of, I don't know about cherries, but in the case of apples, if the trees have been out there for any length of time, you already have infections in those buds. And when you get that push in the spring, that first infection can likely determine how well your fungicide program is going to look the rest of the way. And one of the things that Gatton will do is it is extremely effective on that primary infection prior to the secondary spread. So it's an excellent product, even if you're tank mixing with something for, say, monolinea at the time. It's still an excellent product to put out at those early timings on the stone fruit because it is so effective at that timing.
Thank you. A couple of questions about the regulatory timeline, and maybe I can take that for the group. At this point, we are working towards a registration in time for the 2022 season. I think hard to speculate beyond that, but we expect that it'll be available for grower use this year. So sorry, just scanning through the questions. Is any work being done, James, for a registration for China?
Not that I'm aware of. We do not market in that part of the world. Another company markets in China, or if they want to, they market in China. And I do not recall seeing anything. My guess would be that question is linked to MRLs in China. And I think really Gatton is like a lot of other chemicals from a North American perspective, in that the Chinese still do not have their own system in place that's reliably can be used for import tolerances. And to date, even though there's nothing written in stone, to date, for the most part, China has accepted as a default codex tolerances. So my guess is that when codex finally gets around to all these different crops that would apply, that by default, China will adapt the codex tolerances for the gatton, or the flutinol, the active ingredient, of course. Again, it's just China right now is because I know this from not just gatton, but from a number of different molecules, that China is, it's virtually impossible outside of China to get a direct import tolerance there. Taiwan, other Asian countries are very different, but China, People's Republic of China, you just have to keep your fingers crossed that they'll continue to accept codex tolerances in the future.
Another question that maybe I'll take is, we talked about the proposed rate of gatton, and then a question about if it's prior to full canopy in a smaller plant, what would the rate be then, or how would you adjust the rate? And my suggestion would be that there's probably a crop adapted spraying discussion to be had there, and to contact your local cohort wholesale representative and talk about that specifically to your own farm. All right, I think that has answered all the questions in the chat. So we'll wrap up there. James, thank you very much for reaffirming our understanding of the powdery mildew life cycle, and also giving us some insights into how that should influence our management decisions. Also, thank you for sharing with us this gatton, the new tool in our powdery mildew toolbox, particularly useful as we start to lose some of our existing chemistries like Quintec. To all the people on the webinar today, thank you very much for joining us. As I mentioned earlier, the webinar has been recorded and will be available to all the attendees about 24 hours from now. And you can also find it at fruitandveggie.com/webinars. If anyone would like more information on gatton, please contact your local crop input retailer or your local cohort wholesale technical sales specialist. Thank you again to everyone for joining us, and we hope that you enjoy the rest of your day.